Hello friends, today's lecture by Professor Nagpal, Payal Nagpal, is on Carlyle, and Carlyle, as you know, is a 19th century thinker. Dr. Payal Nagpal has been teaching for a long time English in Janki Devi Memorial College, Delhi University, and she has published a number of books, and she is the fittest person to talk about Carlyle because she has the sense of the presence of what can be called the 19th century tradition. And Carlyle, has been wrongly, in my opinion, maybe Professor Nagpal will disagree with me, has been called an aesthete in the 19th century. And my understanding is that he was a product of, largely, of Victorianism, and things were so difficult at that time that a person who didn't reject the thing wholly would not be actually a part of the larger humanist tradition. So Carlyle, in my opinion, is a socialist, is a person who believes in equality, believes in a kind of purity of art, and that art and purity, these things, keep him separate from the 19th century malaise of what can be called progress. And that's hardly a progress, that's at the cost of colonies. Victorianism is actually based on colonies. Therefore, it's a difficult thing, and I think Professor Payal Nagpal will make it lucid, as is a want generally, for us to understand what Carlyle says in his essays under the category of English essay. So, I'll now hand over the mic, so to say, to Professor Nagpal, and please begin.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. As you rightly pointed out that one looks at Carlyle as a product of the Victorian period. But interestingly, there are two challenges in discussing Carlyle. One, that Carlyle was born in 1795 and lives up to 1881. So, in a sense, as much a product of Victorian thought as he is of the transition from the 18th century to the 19th century. So, the Romantic thought. And there is that span that one can see in his writing. So the second challenge is that he's written so much, pretty much from the 1820s, late 1820s, and right up to the time that he lived. So it's he's a classic example also of a writer whose writing has evolved, whose thought processes have changed at times. For in a more constructive manner, and at times in situations of doubt. So I think this element of Victorian doubt is something that is quite evident, in his later writing particularly. And again, we have to acknowledge the fact that he is also somebody who's not just dedicated to literature, but he's a mathematician, and credited with what was called the Carlyle Circle. So. He's a Scottish writer. So he was born, and in southeast Scotland, and he is also known as the Sage of Chelsea because he spent, his a good part of his life there. So, Scottish essayist, a mathematician, he's somebody who's credited with what in the field of mathematics is called the Carlyle Circle. He also began writing later for the Edinburgh Encyclopedia, and is known for works like Sartor Resartus, which appears in 1830s, the French Revolution, of Heroes, which appears in 1840s, Past and Present, Cromwell's Letter. Then he has the Latter-day Pamphlets, which appear in 1850, and we'll certainly discuss those, in some detail. So, and Frederick the Great, which appears in, which is from about 1858 to 65. So, here we see a writer who has a very, very wide span. So, it would be very difficult to kind of do complete justice to Carlyle in a short span, but nonetheless, one will at least try to understand what his primary concerns were, especially in the writing of the essay. So, he was also, actively involved in the field of reading and writing, in the sense that, he founded the London Library, he helped in establishing, the portrait galleries in London, and finally he became the Lord Rector of the University of Edinburgh in 1865. Uh, his biggest contribution is actually bringing German thought into English. So, translation of Goethe's, Wilhelm Meister's apprenticeship, travels, his biography of Schiller. So, a lot of, he's an example in that sense of the intersection of German and English thought, something that we saw quite well, from the late 18th and early 19th century onwards. And certainly he had friends like Charles Lamb and Coleridge, the Romantics, and he was, of course, a very important writer of the Victorian period. Interestingly, in his book, The English Essay and the Essayists, Hugh Walker, calls he's called the historian essayist. So he's also somebody who not just brings together German and English thought, but he's also somebody who uses his, training as a historian to bring that element into the writing of the essay, because the series is on the English essay. So it's important for us to also, look at this very interesting category of the historian essayist. And Walker says that Carlyle is therefore the richest and profoundest. And one of his, of course, greatest services was the mediation between the mind of Germany and the mind of England. So, the essays alone, Walker says that if we just look at the essays and nothing else, the essays, make him that classic mediator between these two thought categories. So, this, I think, is a very important impetus that he brings into the writing of the essay. In a lot of the essays, he discusses German literature at large, and he deals with important thinkers in German literature. And there's Richter and there's Novalis and so on. So be it mysticism, be it rational thought, he's able to kind of bring German thought into England. So there are, of course, his writing is vast. The Uwe is very, very vast, and critics have also kind of been, a bit harsh on Carlyle, because they have felt that he's not really represented his contemporaries well. But there are different points of view here. So, but the important thing is that, as Walker puts it, that in Carlyle's hands, history can never be dry, for it is living. And so his very, very keen appreciation of the value of facts, of the value of thought, and this is combined in all his writing with a very sharp observation of events around. And in the essay, it is important to mark that Carlyle is able to evolve his own point of view about what he is seeing around him. So the essay, in that sense, becomes a historical document, and at the same time, the essay is also something that he can be credited with as an individual, the way he kinds of puts it forward. So before we begin with some of the essays by Carlyle, I'd request Professor Prakash to share his views on this essayist who's bringing in history, who's bringing in logic in some sense, because the way he writes is very, very lucid. He writes a lot, and he writes in a very lucid manner. Maybe his training as a mathematician also kind of brings that to the essay. So the craft of writing is rather different when compared to the other essayists.
See, Dr. Payal Nagpal, you already made clear regarding his background, the role that he could play in the 19th century literature and 19th century thought. And there are certain information which I didn't have as clearly, at least, that he came from Scotland again. Lots of great people, particularly historians. Walter Scott is an example of historical a historical novel, and he's the predecessor of predecessor of that fiction. Has been there for a long time. And yesterday, Dr. Richa Bajaj talked about Boswell, who was also from Scotland, and we have now this person who is from Scotland. And he is able to, as you rightly pointed out, and this is very significant, that he is able to combine the knowledge of philosophy, the knowledge of mathematics, as you call it, with the English literature. And the other thing that is important in his case, and about that also I wasn't exactly aware, that he is a kind of a bridge between German
Yes.
thought, German writing, and English writing.
Biggest contribution.
And so there is a three three-cornered center for him: Scotland, from where he comes; German thought, where he gets his education in philosophy and in thinking. Well, Goethe is an example of that, and then England at least. So this combination would definitely require us to understand him fully and deeply. And then writing an essay, and you say he's a historian in his essays. Now this is a new category in the English essay, because English essay is not supposed to be, it's basically supposed to be entertaining, but in this case it's highly educative, that he informs people about the approach that only history can give. So I think you already have the ground that you have cleared for you to communicate still
Yes.
further regarding his ideas.
In fact, Hugh Walker, in his book on the English essays, classified him as a historian essayist. So, and he certainly brings that, to the table. So, he has, different essays on heroes and hero worship, and then there is the hero as prophet, and then there is the hero as poet, where he discusses Dante and Shakespeare. So, two writers who are, of course, centuries apart. But here, the hero as divinity, the hero as prophet, are productions of old ages, not to be repeated in the new. Now, this concern that there is change and we need to engage with change, this is his strength. This is Carlyle's strongest point, and it is a point that is evident in all his writing. So whatever one picks up, in some form or the other, Carlyle will always spell out the fact that things are changing, and the old structures are not going to be of any use. So those structures need to be revised. At the same time, he will also examine, and very, very critically, the change that has set in, and draw attention to its shortcomings, and almost egg people on to think of further new methods by which a constructive change can, really speaking, set in. So he talks about the hero as divinity, the hero as prophet, and says that these are productions of old ages, that to look at the divine, to look at the prophet, this is a context that belongs to the old ages. It cannot be repeated in the new. So it clearly tells us that this is a voice which is secular, this is a voice which is objective in thought, and he bears that out in his writing. They presuppose, he says, a certain rudeness of conception, which the progress of mere scientific knowledge puts an end to. So here again we see Carlyle as telling the reader that the structures, the forms in which heroes have been created and revered, those forms may not hold crown in the 19th century, because one of the biggest reasons is scientific knowledge. So rationality, scientific thought, something that the 19th century inherits from the 18th century. So all that ensures that you cannot look at the world around you like you were doing earlier. So in this age, he brings in the figure of the poet and says the poet is a heroic figure belonging to all ages, whom all ages possess. So it's not as if, so firstly, a kind of rejection of, the earlier forms, but at the same time, the poet is not a new creation. It is a heroic figure that belongs to all ages, and every age, has its own poet. When to quote Carlyle, when once he is produced, whom the newest age as the oldest may produce, and will produce always when nature pleases. Let nature send a hero soul. In no age is it other than possible that he may be shaped into a poet. So here, and this is from 1840, So, it's pretty much the transition period from the Romantic to the Victorian. Now, one thing which is very significant here is the way in which he brings in nature. And what we see is that the Romantic writers had a certain preoccupation with nature, but his understanding of nature is very different. It's social, it's also individual, because the individual is part of the society and the individual has to partake, in a sense, of the way in which society conceives of nature. So, let nature send a hero soul, and in no age is it other than possible that he may be shaped into a poet. So, the new times place a demand that anybody who's organically integrated with nature is kind of also looking at the poet or shaping the poet as the hero. So and he also says that the poet and the prophet, he says they emerge from the same word, that is Vates, as in VATES, and says that they are similar because both the poet and the prophet have penetrated into the universe. He says, and he quotes Goethe, who says that, which is the greatest secret. So it says, the open secret, open to all, seen by none. So the poet has the ability to actually understand nature, and this aspect of nature is something that is very well integrated with society. It's not nature in isolation, it is in a social sense that he uses the term nature. Professor Prakash, should you like to share
I would
your
like
views?
to put in one or two things here, which you suggested very clearly. Nature in the 19th century meant something different than what it did in the 18th and earlier centuries, because in the 19th century there have been philosophers, there have been scientists, there have been knowledge seekers who have put their entire thing by nature. For instance, what's the name? The famous naturalist who talked about the idea of evolution.
Charles Darwin.
Charles Darwin. He is there in the 19th century. He is a contemporary of this person,
Yes.
and he brought in nature in a different sense. That all of us, are products of nature. Society itself is a product of nature, and we evolve as human beings only in association with nature. So that kind of understanding was not available to people in the 18th century. So I think he is very clearly identifying himself with the ideas of Darwin and others. Marx, for instance, they are all contemporaries. So Marx will talk about society structures, and Darwin will talk about the idea of nature in society, in the middle of human life. So I think it's a very fine example. And then one more thing I would like to say in the context of identifying the poet as hero. This is something remarkable. I could never imagine that a person who is so much steeped in what can be called thought, in materialism, in politics and in other things, would be identify hero as a revolutionary.
Yes.
And straight away the idea of Shelley comes to mind, who's great. He greatly identifies with the skylark. So skylark is the poet, in fact.
Yes.
And that straight away taken a kind of acceptance for us. So I believe that the poet can understand, and in fact this kind of a thing we should also realize in our own context, that in the 21st century it's the poet who is able to see things much more clearly than anybody else would do. So that's a contribution of Carlyle, if one has to think of contribution, that poets are the people who can understand, irrespective of classes they come from, irrespective of the classes that they are addressing, that they are the true bearers of the poetic truth and the social truth.
And also the ability, according to Carlyle, the ability of the poet to understand the society, to understand the world around. So that is very important. And again, I think you made a very important point by comparing him with his kind of writing with, let's say, that of Charles Darwin. And it's true that in some of the essays, even the language is a clear reflection of the way in which scientific terminology actually entered literature and writing. I mean, if we also look at Balzac's The Society as Historical Organism, we see so much of, so many references actually to the field of science, especially biology. And here too, in the use of the words like tissue and so on. So there are in fact direct references actually to some of the terms from the field of science, from the discipline of science. So I think these writers.
I would like to. You see, you have done special study of realism in the 19th century. So straight away, I'm thinking of that. The realism has its roots in the 19th century, and Balzac is one person there, present at the same time.
Yes,
wonderful.
So because the essay that we are discussing about the hero as poet, so he is written in 1840. So this is also in a sense a transition period. I mean, 1850s, 1859 is when we look at Darwin's Origin of Species, but the work had started much before that. In fact, the first couple of decades of the 19th century were dedicated in a sense to changes in the discipline of science, and in fact, in a certain sense, the formulation of that discipline in a very different manner. So all these factors, really speaking, can be seen to influence the writing of writers like Balzac, or for that matter Carlyle. So he says that the way the prophet, he says, has sees that sacred mystery rather on the moral side, where in terms of religion you decide on good and evil, but the way it's poet, on what the Germans call the aesthetic side, the beautiful and the like. Now, as I mentioned, that different essays bring out different aspects of, what really speaking Carlyle is elaborating. So, where he brings in the beautiful and the like, by bringing in German aesthetics, and by bringing in German critics and German philosophy, at the same time, he never loses sight of matter, and for him it is always the material that is privileged over anything else, even the aesthetic, I would say, in a certain sense. But he's only kind of he brings in the aesthetic to talk about the beauty in a sense of let's say poetry. So he says, for example, that the poet, again a term that he brings in from German thought, but in translation he says it has an infinitude in him. So there is something infinite in the poet. So the poet has the capacity, the potential to go beyond his own biases, to go beyond his own constructions, to actually be influenced by society and to understand it in a way that is probably not available to the layman. So he then, of course, goes on to talk about meter in poetry, and how everything that is musical, really speaking, belongs to the realm of poetry. But he also brings in passionate speech and says that all deep things, to quote Carlyle, he says, all deep things are song. So even within the same essay, now all these thoughts are packed in the same essay. And one can see how aesthetics in that sense is combined with the infinitude in a poet, and meter that he discusses, how meter is there in poetry which lends it the musical quality. And he says that everything that has a certain depth to it, really speaking, is like a song. And he then goes on to, of course, discuss two very important writers. One is Dante and the other is Shakespeare. And he begins by giving a very, very brief biography. And he says that they are a peculiar two. He talks about the two together, and then, of course, goes on to first discuss Dante and then Shakespeare. And his essays are very long. So he says they dwell apart in a kind of royal solitude, none equal and none second to them. And he says that in the general feeling of a certain kind of transcendentalism, he says they are canonized. And he says they are canonized though no pope or cardinals took hand in doing it. So he says that their canonization has nothing to do with religion. The fact that they have survived centuries, the fact that we still go back to a Dante or a Shakespeare, tells us that these are writers who have performed a certain role in society, and that is of understanding everything. So he says that in spite of the most unheroic times and our, he says, indestructible reverence for heroism, he says if we want to look at what is heroic in the age, and he says drop the indestructible reverence, he says actually one needs to look at these writers. He says the poet Dante and the poet Shakespeare. So what little it is permitted us to say here of the hero as poet will most fitly arrange itself in that fashion. So he then appreciates the ability of both these writers to actually understand society and the change that had set in. And in both he sees the potential to associate with the change that is setting in the society and how these writers were able to capture that change. So he says that Dante in that sense was Italian, and he brought in, he was supposed to embody musically the religion of the Middle Ages, and Shakespeare, he says, embodies for us the outer life of our Europe as developed then. Its chivalries, courtesies, humors, ambitions, whatever the practical way of thinking, acting, and so on was there. So he says that the Christian faith, which was the theme of Dante's song, had produced this practical life which Shakespeare was to sing. So it's very interesting the way in which he actually draws a connection between these two writers. So and he says that what in a sense Dante begins, it is something that reaches its culmination in a very different manner in Shakespeare. So this I think point of connection between these two writers, be it in the context of religion, be it in the context of society, for Carlyle, that becomes their understanding of what he says is nature. He says that is what kind of connects the two writers.
No, these are two very good examples, Dante and Shakespeare. And Dante, as you said, that belongs to the idea of medievalism, which was presented in a very unique form, very concrete form, and then comes Shakespeare, who completely turns the tables and becomes what you call the poet of the finite. Yes. So in fact, the word finite and infinite, these are new words to me after listening to you, because finite is material. Finite is something that is in front of us, and we can, if we like, go into infinity, and we are not going to infinity at all. So I think Carlyle himself, I think he has used the word very consciously, and he pointed out in your explanation that finite is the thing, and that has a logic, that has a kind of nature in it, and that is to be pursued, even though infinite is also can be visualized in the presence of the finite. So I think that's a very good contribution, at least to my understanding of things in the 19th century. And friends, Dr. Payal Nagpal has already made it clear that concerns of Carlyle are of the 19th century, but they are of poetry, they are of literature, even though he came from a different background. So, well, now we can't wait to consider his essays, observe the truth of the essays that he wrote. And in the next part of the lecture, Professor Payal Nagpal will tell us about the essays that he wrote. And the only indication that she has given is that they are long essays. So I would like to ask that question also when she opens, that the long essay is not the staple, the bread and butter of the English essay. So how does one, do that? Because I think these essays are seminal. The only point that you have given very positive is that they are very lucid. Yes. So lucidity makes them, the part of the English essay. So we will talk about that in the second part, Professor Payal Nagpal. So till then, we have to hold our breath. Thank you.